It's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Joseph J. Williams. He brings an interesting background that combines the local and the global. He comes from Trinidad, as you'll notice as soon as he starts speaking. He did his PhD here at UC Berkeley in the psychology department, working with Tanya Lombroso and Tom Griffiths and focusing on computational cognitive science. Afterwards, he traveled a large distance institutionally with a postdoc at Stanford and a research fellowship position at Harvard. Then he was an assistant professor in the School of Computing at the National University of Singapore, where he worked on information systems and analytics. And he's now at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto, where he's also a faculty affiliate with the Vector Institute of Artificial Intelligence and the Department of Psychology. In addition to his geographic span, Joseph's work spans several disciplines, especially psychology, technology, and education. His research aims to develop ways of personalizing learning interactions between humans and computers. Examples include using the computer to serve as an expert instructor for explanations of math problems, and personalizing messages to increase motivation in an email campaign. As you probably know, personalizing interactions is a harder problem than simply using a computer to deliver content. And it's also harder than simply giving personalized explanations. The systems that he's working on are self-improving systems, collecting data about their interactions with humans and using that information to generate improved ways of helping humans learn. Joseph will tell us more about this work with today's talk, enhancing and personalizing educational technology using randomized micro-experiments to bridge education, human-computer interaction, psychology, and statistical machine learning.
Great, thanks, Lloyd. That was a great summary of what I'm doing. Thank you for that. And so, as you can see, I'm doing randomized A/B comparisons, even on titles. So you have a short one and a long one. You can see which one you prefer based on the particular personality you have, and give feedback on which one you like more. And so, as Lloyd mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in computer science, but I'm also cross-point in psychology. So I'm always excited to attract students for grad school who might have human interaction backgrounds, psychology, education. They can apply to either department. And I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago, so I'm glad Lloyd mentioned that because people say they missed the first part of my talk trying to guess where I'm from. So now I have your full attention. And one thing I want to say is I hold my lab meetings. Actually, we have a Skype connection for every meeting. And I've been thinking a lot about how do you run a lab in a way that you can have a broader participation, right? So everyone across the world can easily jump in and hear what's happening. You can give a practice talk, you can share and provide insights. So just letting you all know, we have an open invitation to people. We meet in person and have a Skype connection so other people can join in. And you can always email if you're interested in joining the mailing list to hear what's on. And so I guess in that vein, I'll start like announcements and opportunities. So feel free to email me comments or ask questions or add links to your own work as you're seeing this talk. And as I mentioned, the research group meetings are online. So you can also email me if you want to present remotely, whether it's a practice talk, a formal presentation, if you just want to brainstorm and get feedback on an idea, or just hear what our lab's doing. You can always join and we can have a session where people share about different projects. And as I mentioned, you can also drop in on group meetings via Skype. So if you email this address, just Google Groups, you can actually join a mailing list. And it's a nice low-touch way to keep in touch because you can then get an email when we have topics every week, every other week, and see if it's relevant, just jump on Skype and say hello. And as I mentioned, I'm always excited to recruit grad students. So University of Toronto, it's a lot like a US kind of system, and there's information from prospective grad students on what we do and how to kind of learn more about the lab. And again, in the spirit of broad participation, undergraduates at any university can actually volunteer remotely. So they could ask, can I become involved in a project? And even before they come to grad school, they could get a sense of what it's like to be involved in a research project. Do they like the kind of style of our lab and the work we do? Or they could also visit as well. If people are interested in methodologies in this talk, I actually have a grad course I teach every year, and we put some of those materials online. So there's a description there. You can always contact me for the actual recordings of videos or online resources. And I'm regularly a co-PI on US grants, so we apply for NSF grants with different colleagues, National Institutes of Health, and I have a grant now for Office of Naval Research. So if they're good opportunities for people where you're applying for grants, we are often co-PI grants, even though it's across the border. So let me know if you're interested. Does that make sense in terms of announcements, opportunities? Just sharing what I have, and send me anything that you all up to as well. So I guess to jump into the talk, the key thing in our lab is that our Intelligent Adaptive Interventions Lab focuses on this guiding question. How can we perpetually enhance the design of in-the-wild systems using randomized A/B experiments? And I just mean a randomized comparison with 2 or more conditions. It's called A/B testing in industry, randomized control trial. For example, how do we enhance online homework? By A/B experimenting with the explanations of concepts. Or how would we help mental health? By A/B testing in an app, which questions you ask people to help them reflect on their emotions. And the reason we do this is because, like many of you, we're interested in problems of technology to enhance education and health. In an ideal world, all of these online resources, whether they're massive open online courses, or even your on-campus resources, would make available the knowledge and interactions people need so they can learn anything they want. They can learn how to program, they can learn the material they need to transition their careers. And if we can do this successfully, then we can have a huge impact on people's personal success, on their ability to go into new careers, and really supercharge the economy. We also think a lot about learning more informally. For example, if you think about big social problems like mental health or physical health, some of the best solutions to these are actually the right kind of training and knowledge. For example, in the United Kingdom, cognitive behavior therapy, which is a set of techniques from clinical psychology for helping people manage their emotions by noticing and changing their thoughts. It's so effective, not just for things like depression, but also even quitting smoking, that doctors can write a prescription for online digital CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. And so I won't talk about that work too much today, but we have published papers on how people learn cognitive behavior therapy. And in general, we're really interested in using technology to provide everyday activities people can use to manage stress, or encouraging people to exercise more, even by sending text messages and figuring out which messages really motivate people. And if you want to think about this from an educational lens, I think about it this way. Our lab is really trying to help the entire student. Formal education, programming, math, other topics, as well as informal learning of skills to promote mental and physical health. So we want to help people to learn whatever they need to solve the problems they care about and to have the kind of life they enjoy. I don't think I have to convince many of you, though, that this huge vision of technology is not nearly where it could be. A lot of online resources don't help people learn as much as they could. The app stores have hundreds of apps for managing stress, but when you quantifiably measure, they don't always impact people's behavior. So the thing we struggle with is there's huge promise, but no technology is ever good enough, even when hundreds of thousands of people are using it. So how do we do research to improve these technologies when they're actually out in the wild? And the vision we aim for is to take any in-the-wild technology, like an online course or online homework, and make it a perpetual improving system, just like a real teacher is. So let me illustrate this with a contrast between the instructors at U of T and their online homework. Yes?
Take a question.
Sure.
It's more a question of scope.
Sure.
Some of what you talked about is, traditional AD is can you enhance click-through rates by changing
Yes.
the background color?
Yes.
That's sort of a very quasi-perceptual level. I'm getting towards some notion of levels
Yes.
of interaction. And you mentioned too, on the smoking cessation, which is more call it habituation,
Yes.
habit development, which has hit the popular press years ago, and has I think a healthy life. But the other one is, as you touched on here, higher level cognitive things. I mean, matrix algebra.
Yes.
For gosh sakes.
Yes.
Where intuition mixes in with formal knowledge, and intuition should lead formal knowledge, for example. It's very, very complex environments. So do you make a distinction there? Are you going to make a distinction there, or kind of figure they're all of the same breed?
So I guess I'll restate the question if it's okay. You're kind of asking, what's the scope of this?
Yeah.
Randomized A/B experiments can be used, am I saying that randomized A/B experiments can be used for all these different topics? And what I would say is that I think actually there's a lot of potential and promise, right? In the sense that anytime you can give people 2 or more experiences, that's a place where this methodology could be useful. For example, if you want to teach people math, then what are all the places where you make many decisions as a teacher? Do I need to motivate this person right now by saying to them that they're doing a good job? Or do I need to ask them a question to help them reflect? That's a case where maybe experimentation could be helpful. When you want to get people to exercise more or deal with stress, do you ask them, what can you do to feel better? Option A, or maybe option B. What's bothering you right now? So I think the idea here is that these methodologies could be very relevant to a wide range of situations. And so I think our lab sees our job as figuring out, well, how do you use experimentation to help in these scenarios? And also, when is it actually not as effective as other methods? Because there are other times when you may do more qualitative work. You may just do design research where you build a system. So I guess, and maybe we can come back to this more in discussion.
Yeah.
But I agree with you that a lot of where A/B experimentation is applied now, for like getting you all to use Facebook. On Facebook right now, they have millions of A/B experiments running. And we're really interested in getting the scale and the excitement of that to be used for social problems like education and health.
But you may presuppose a conception, if you're operating the level of concepts, conceptually recognizable, distinct conceptions being presented as part of the choice, and maybe consciously recognized as such by all participants, which then is a complex sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of this vision of perpetually improving systems, just like a real teacher, let's contrast how a lot of online resources are compared to how people operate. For example, at University of Toronto, my co-instructors will complain, Joseph, my online homework compared to me. In my online homework, the interaction rarely changes. Student 1, 2, 3 to 1,000 comes in and they get the same answer explanation over and over again. But when I see my co-instructor with a student, if a student attempts homework, afterwards, the teacher varies interaction. They might explain things in different ways, they might ask questions. And this is helpful because then they're able to learn over time, well, what's working? And they might even develop some hypotheses about how to personalize. What should I do based on someone's current knowledge state? So how can we make online homework be a bit more like a real teacher? And so our approach is to think about using A/B experiments to achieve this goal. And why would it be beneficial to use experiments to design these in the wild, real-world technology? First of all, I should say is that we just want to better understand what are different ways of using experimentation to complement all the other methods in human-computer interaction and education, so we can explore what kinds of problems experimentation can be good for. How can we push the boundaries? I will say that our lab finds that experiments, we like them because when you get decisive data, which is really 1 in 1,000, decisive data from an experiment is one of the strongest tests of an idea, because you can measure on a quantitative variable that X has done better than Y. But even when you get mixed results, which is much more common, they drive design forward because they require precision in several ways. One is measurement. It forces us to think about how we quantitatively specify a behavior outcome. How do we operationalize learning? Another is in design. We have to precisely specify what are alternatives. When I think that asking someone to explain helps learning, what exactly does it mean to explain? Do I mean explain why the answer is correct? Or do I mean explain what concept they used? I have to specify and compare these. I think what's also exciting is that experiments give opportunities to use large-scale data from hundreds of people to rapidly improve. When you find evidence that something's A is better than B, you can then roll it out more quickly to future people. And so here's our approach: to use experimentation while trying to make it more collective, dynamic, and personalizing. And I'll illustrate that with a story from an instructor. If an instructor at my university, she comes to me and says, well, Joseph, how are you going to take your education and human-computer interaction research and help me improve my online homework, my online programming homework? Well, we'd say to her, okay, let's run some A/B experiments to figure out what we can make better. And then she might push back and say, well, here's the thing is, I know that you all can design an experiment using all those great publications in cognitive science and psychology and education. But what happens when you move on? I want my homework to be an ecosystem for experimentation in the next 5 years, 10 years. It should never stop improving. And so what we focus on is what we call collective experimentation. How do we make sure we can keep adding new ideas, new conditions in to be tested? And so we do that by thinking about tools we can build, for example, for instructors to test out ideas, as well as processes. For example, how do we make it easy for students to suggest ideas for improving online homework, and have these experimentally evaluated on a level playing field? Well, the instructor might say, great, now I have a sense of how we're going to test out ideas for the next 10 years. But Joseph, how do we make sure this data is actually going to help my students in days or weeks, not months? And so we focus on making experiments more dynamic. And to give you basically that means using data as quickly as we can to analyze what's working and give more promising conditions to future students and remove less promising ideas. Here's a concrete example of that. When you do an experiment, you assign 50-50, right? If you have two conditions, 50% A, 50% B. Well, actually, what we do is we use Bayesian statistics and machine learning algorithms that will actually analyze data to change the probability of assignment over time. For example, if you can reinterpret 50-50 as saying, I think there's a 50% chance either of these is good. But what if actually after 20 participants come in and they get explanation A or B and they've rated them, a 7 versus an 8? Well, you have some evidence that B might be better than A. So maybe actually there's a 60% chance that B is higher rated and a 40% chance that A is. Well, what if we re-rate randomization? So now we actually assign people not 50-50, but actually with a higher probability. So now there's a 60% chance of getting B and a 40% chance of A. We might then get data from 50 more people, and we get stronger evidence. Maybe now we think there's an 80% chance that B is better, and a 20% chance that A is. Do you kind of see how this kind of approach might actually continuously move you from traditional experiments to actually enhancement, where eventually some may be given with 100% probability? So instructor says, well, if you can pull that off, then I can see how that actually gets continual improvement. You can keep removing ideas that aren't promising, and then now we can do more collective experimentation, add new ideas into the loop. But they might then wonder, well, what if it's the case that actually, even though B is better than A on average, it might be that A is better for students in one point circumstance, and B is better in another circumstance. For example, based on whether students are motivated or not. And so this is where we focus on what we call personalizing experiments. So trying to design experiments where we want to have hypotheses about when A might be helpful, A is better than B in one circumstance, and B is better than A in another. And so we want to use experiments to discover how to personalize. So hopefully you're all excited about this vision. You can take something like just online homework, or even the emails you send, and do this kind of collective, dynamic personalizing experiment. But actually making this happen is a challenge. When I first tried to run A/B experiments in settings like Khan Academy, or edX, or Canvas, it was hard just to do randomization. And so what we've done is actually built this infrastructure that we call the Mooklet web service. And it basically means if you want to run an experiment, I'd recommend you use this. Because it lets you run your traditional A/B comparison, but also it buys you everything else. You can keep adding conditions over time, and you can use different algorithms to dynamically experiment, or even do personalizing experiments. So to give an overview, I started on this vision. Let's take any piece of an online course, or even a digital interaction, and make it a perpetually improving system, just like a real teacher. And our lab's approach is to think of A/B experiments and make them more collective, dynamic, and personalizing. So I'm going to give one example, which is a system we built that would crowdsource explanations from learners while they're solving problems, and then dynamically experiment to figure out which explanations are higher rated. And we showed that this actually results in explanations that help learning just as much as those from a real instructor. The second set of results I present is thinking about dynamic experiments and how they can be useful for instructors. So we present a system we built that lets instructors conduct a dynamic experiment in their homework so they can actually use data in real time to test out the ideas they have. I then also present work on how can researchers then start to think about analyzing data from dynamic experiments. What do they need to know or worry about if they want to analyze these kinds of experiments so they can also draw conclusions? And I'll finally close with one example of using experiments to discover how to personalize, which is a big focus of what we're doing now. And I can talk a bit about ongoing and future work, but I'll just give you 20 seconds just to read through that. A lot of statistical work on dynamic experiments and machine learning algorithms that can interact with people, or that people can guide. How can we design experiments differently to basically try and discover how to personalize? And within education, many questions about what prompts we give people to explain, giving hints in programming, and what we call meta skills, helping students learn how to set goals effectively or reduce procrastination. And within health, thinking about students as well as the whole population, how do we give them activities to help them manage stress? Based on CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, how do we encourage them to exercise? So to start this first demonstration, in this research, we built a system that we call AXIS, the Adaptive Explanation Improvement System. And here's the problem we're trying to solve. Instructors complain that students often attempt problems over and over, but they don't really understand it. And so they can become demotivated, think that they just can't master programming or math, and then be more likely to drop out. There's evidence from educational psychology that giving people explanations to highlight principles can be helpful for them understanding how to solve a problem and generalize it. So ideally, we could conduct experiments to figure out which explanations are most effective. But what do instructors say at this idea? Well, some instructors will say, Joseph, there are actually 0 explanations in my online homework now. If I don't have time to write a single explanation for those hundreds of problems, how am I going to write multiple to then aid the experiment? So how can we tackle this kind of problem? Well, one insight from work I've done before and published in psychology as well as human-computer interaction is that explaining why an answer is correct can actually help students learn, prompting them to explain their reasoning. So suppose we could prompt people in the right way and then use their explanations to give to other students. That would give us a way to keep adding new conditions into an experiment. But then we need to actually then dynamically figure out which of these are actually going to be helpful. So in this study that we deployed, here's the interaction learners had. They'd seen an online problem, and eventually they'd attempted and get told the answer. We then actually randomized them to different explanations and asked them how helpful was the above information for your learning, from 0, complete and helpful, to 10, perfectly helpful. This is our dependent variable. We're going to optimize for this. And we actually considered 3 or 4 other different measures. But this turned out to be the one that actually seemed to be best for predicting explanation quality. And I can discuss more later. We then asked students to help you learn, explain in your own words why the answer is correct. And you will see how this can help students, but also it can help the entire system. If their explanations are longer than 50 characters, and they also indicate that they think the explanation will be helpful for other people, then we add it to our existing pool. So is it clear how we get students to generate explanations in a way that helps them reflect, but also can give us ideas to test out with new students? So now the challenge we have is, how do we do dynamic experimentation on these explanations? And the broad way we think about dynamic experimentation, building on a lot of previous work in machine learning, is how do we balance discovery, figuring out which explanations are actually highly rated, with improvement, using that data quickly to give the next learner a better explanation. So we model this as what's called a multi-arm Bandit problem, and this is a subset of the field of reinforcement learning. In a multi-arm Bandit problem, the challenge is that you have a set of actions, such as different explanations, and your goal is to maximize a reward. In this case, it might be ratings of those explanations from 0 to 10. Your goal is to try and give students just highly rated explanations. But of course, the challenge is balancing discovery. We have to collect some data versus improvement. How do I use that data really quickly to help to give better rated explanations to future people? So to tackle this problem, we need a policy or an algorithm for learning a policy. We use something called randomized probability matching, which I gestured to earlier on, an algorithm called Thompson sampling. And here's an intuitive sketch of what the algorithm does. For each explanation, it estimates what's the probability that this is the highest rated explanation, given the data I have so far. And then it says, let me assign that explanation with the probability that it's the highest rated. So 50% might mean that based on the data I saw so far, there's a 50% chance this is the highest rated explanation. And you all can see what a 65% probability of assignment would mean. Just to dive into the math for a second, the specific thing this relies on is a particular model and set of parameters. And so in this scenario, what we do is we model the probability of an explanation being rated as helpful as following a beta distribution with prior parameters, 19 and 1. Intuitively, you can think of it this way. Before I see any data, I'm going to act as if every explanation has gotten a rating of a 9 and a second rating of a 10. So it's as if the average rating of an explanation before I see data is a 9.5. I'm really optimistic it's good, but I don't believe it strongly because I just got 2 observations. Well, now you'd say, as I get learners actually rating explanations, how do I update my estimate of what the real rating is? And so we use Bayesian inference here, and the key idea is that the reward rating is assumed to follow binomial distribution with 10 samples, and the probability of success is drawn from that beta distribution. Intuitively, think about it like this. You start off assuming every explanation is rated a 9 and a 10. Then someone rates it a 6. It's like you got 6 thumbs up and 4 thumbs down. Then someone rates it a 7. It's like 7 thumbs up and 3 thumbs down. So you basically are using Bayesian inference to update your estimate of what's the real mean rating of this explanation. Is it a 6, a 7, or 8? How sure am I that that's the true rating? Does that make sense? It's actually tracking information that's somewhat related to what you would do in a statistical test like a t-test. What's the difference between means? And then based on the number of samples I have, how sure should I be that that difference is a true one? Roughly. So the way we estimate what's the probability this is the highest rated explanation is based on the ratings that's gone so far, 4, 5, 6, and how many of those ratings it has. So how sure we should be that that's really the highest rated. So when we deploy this, we actually tried it out with just 150 learners. And this is actually in a mechanical Turk experiment, so like a lab study. At the beginning, the reason we chose 150 is because we want to see, could this solution work even with just the size of a big undergrad class? Could we get this to work without thousands of people? At the beginning, there's no explanation. Over time, eventually, a learner adds an explanation, and it's long enough, and they say it's helpful, so it gets added to the pool. Then there might be 2 explanations. And remember that we're re-rating randomization based on higher explanations getting higher chance of being presented. So after 150 people, you end up with this policy, which is a probability distribution over explanations. For example, some explanations have a 1% or 2% chance of being presented. Some have an 18% or 22%. And these are the higher rated explanations. So what do we get from this so far? Well, the algorithm seems to be able to learn, based on some explanations being rated higher, that they should be presented more frequently. But does this actually help learning? So we did an evaluation in a totally separate experiment. What we did is we compared actually the original problems that have no explanations at all, like a lot of online homework right now, maybe even online homework in your course, to problems that actually had explanations from the AXIS system. The adaptive explanation improvement system was crowdsourcing some learners and running it through this dynamic experimentation algorithm. So we're going to look at a pre to post test. If you get a pre-test on these geometry and algebra problems, then you get problems to practice, then you get a post-test. How much do you learn, and how does that compare to getting problems to practice with the explanations from the system? Now, what controls do we want here? We also included as a control problems with the explanations that were filtered out, meaning that they were low-rated explanations that the AXIS system gave less than 5% probability. And a gold standard, how much does this help learning compared to giving problems with the explanations written by the instructor?
So, as a check. So the AXIS explanations are being created by learners.
Yes, they're actually typing them in and they're getting added.
Okay, and then they're prompted for this. Is there randomization of the prompt, or
No, there's no randomization of the prompt here.
So
Everyone gets a prompt, but a lot of people don't fill it out, just some.
So, but the understanding is learners have an equal responsibility to provide explanations. They may or they may not.
Yes.
I'm just trying to get to the motivation.
For this, yes. I think the main motivation for someone is what we said, which is to help you learn, explain in your own words why this answer is correct. So the main motivation we present here is that reflecting will help you learn.
And then just a check on what the notion of explanation is here. Structurally, there's no structure in an explanation.
No, they write all kinds of
It's
things.
a text string with equality. That's all you get.
Yes.
The capital A set.
Yes.
Okay, so no.
And then the key thing is that as people are rating explanations, the system is using those ratings to present some explanations more frequently if they're higher rated.
Now, an explanation could be, the answer is?
Yes, exactly. So what are the results we get? The vertical axis has accuracy increase from pre to post. And what you can see is that the axis explanations significantly increase learning relative to the original problems. Even though they were written by other students, once it's actually run through this algorithm, you identify high-rated explanations that significantly improve learning. If you're skeptical, you would ask, well, of course they help because any explanation would have helped, right, compared to nothing. Actually, explanations that were filtered out, in a sense that learners wrote them, but the algorithm gave them low probability because they were low rated, are like giving no explanation at all. It's not just any explanation, it matters that we actually use this filtering method. And finally, how good will this have to be relative to the instructor's explanation? Like, does it have to be like 50% is good or 30% is good? There isn't actually a significant difference in learning from the instructor's explanation versus this system. And so I think a really interesting question for the future is, under what conditions is this kind of approach, pulling from learners and then trying to dynamically experiment, going to be better than instructors, the same, or is it going to be worse? There may be circumstances where we need instructors to step in and actually correct the algorithm. You might just think of fake news, right? People tend to rate it as really high and compelling and useful, but that's because there's some misconceptions at play. So that's a really interesting direction for future work, is how do you build a system so that instructors or other people can step into the loop and guide the algorithm for when it's going to get really good explanations versus less good ones. So what are the contributions of this work? This is one scalable method for collective experimentation. how do we actually get learners themselves to keep providing ideas or conditions, explanations that we can actually experiment with as a byproduct of learning, because they're just reflecting. So if you're crowdsourcing, my colleagues and I think of this as learner resourcing. It's also a good demonstration of using dynamic experiments to rapidly use data to sort more and less promising ideas. So I'm going to move on to the second set of work, which is about thinking about dynamic experiments and what value they can bring to instructors and what challenges they can pose for researchers. So the question here might be, how do we make experimentation more useful to instructors? So they don't see it as just a scientific tool, but something that they can use in their practice. And secondly, this is a novel kind of method, right? What challenges do researchers face if they analyze data from dynamic experiments? If instructors insisted on running everything this way, how would researchers, what would they need to know? So this is a CAI, Computer-Human Interaction paper from 2018. And the key thing we tried here was to think, what does it mean to take an instructor-centered approach to experimentation rather than a scientific tool? And we had two goals. One was to help instructors deploy experiments and obtain data with minimal programming. The second goal was to help instructors more rapidly use data for practical improvement. And so in the previous setting, we actually built on that substantially by saying to instructors, well, when you give your online homework to students, and this was actually in Canvas, which I think is used at Berkeley. So we built a system that any of you could plug into Canvas, we plugged into edX, you can plug into a lot of different systems, or use your own own. We want to say to them, when you give your students online homework, and they attempt a problem, what should happen next? We want to let you be able to experiment on what should happen next. And so that's a screenshot of an interface for instructors just editing. Well, after someone clicks submit, here's what I want to happen. Some instructors gave like feedback messages. Some instructors tried to give like tips or reflection prompts. But the instructor puts these in, and then they submit this, and it gets deployed out to students. So here's an example of a dashboard the instructor sees while the experiment's running dynamically. What you can see is that because the algorithm is doing a dynamic experiment, the instructor can actually see, well, what's the probability of an explanation at a point in time? So there might be 23% of seeing this explanation and a 77% of that one. We're also trying to make these algorithms interpretable to instructors. For example, they can see that the reason this is happening is because the mean student rating was a 7.26 versus 7.48, and that 46 versus 56 students rating those. To remind you, what's going on here is that we explained to instructors the probability of students assigned to a message is approximately based on the probability of that message being highest rated. So it starts out with 50-50, goes to 60-40, 70-30, and eventually it'll hopefully converge to 100, where people are just getting everything all the time. So we successfully deployed this with 3 Harvard instructors who use this to do experiments in their online homework. They said that it lowered barriers, that actually helped them reflect on pedagogy. They said, I never really seriously considered testing multiple versions as we're now doing. So even if we don't get any significant data, that will have a benefit in my mind. So this is interesting. You might almost ask, well, what does it look like to do a thought randomized experiment? Just having people think through, if you had to compare multiple alternatives and try and measure them, would just that activity help you do a better job in evaluating your teaching? Because isn't it the case all the time when we teach that we make decisions, often implicitly, to do A rather than B rather than C? How do we improve the process by which we make those decisions? They liked that this made research practical. So one thing someone said was, you probably know plenty of general things about how students learn, but I know specific things about how they get calculus. I want to understand how people learn in my course and see data about that. Test alternative ideas. They appreciated that it directly helps students, saying, This improved the experience of many of the students by giving them answers that are more helpful. The earlier ones can help improve the experience of the later students. That's pretty neat. And I think this is really just the first step. There are many more interesting, exciting ways we can help instructors experiment, but this is a proof of concept showing the kind of approach we could be using. And I think we still don't understand how to make this work really well and what the limitations are. Students actually did seem to be pretty open to the approach, but I think we need more evaluation here. In an informal survey, some people said, I assume companies always A/B testing on me. At least the way the data I provide can help other people learn. So what are the key contributions of this work? I think it's really thinking about how we can actually think of A/B experiments as a tool for instructors to reflect on their pedagogy and give them tools so they can do collective experimentation. They can test their ideas, they can invite other people to test their ideas and be able to see that data, but also have algorithms that automatically use that data to improve. I think a really key idea for the future is thinking, how should we let instructors guide that algorithm? When do we encourage them to follow it, and when do we encourage them to step in and change what it's doing? For example, to stop an experiment, to add new conditions, to change how data is being handled. Here's a second set of ideas. And the challenge here is, these dynamic experiments are a novel methodology, right? There's a lot of analogous work in the context of health and the medical field, and so we draw a lot on statistics from that area. But it's still not that common to deploy these in real-world settings. And so this paper in Journal of Educational Data Mining, which you can see that URL, try to characterize quantitatively what are the benefits and costs? What do researchers need to know? And so we quantify how much this can help students more quickly, which is good. But also, if you do this when you have just two conditions, A and B, you get reduced statistical power, meaning if there is an effect there, and you do a hypothesis test in a dynamic experiment, what's the probability you correctly detect that there really is a difference? And the reason you have reduced power to discover things is because you're essentially stopping data collection a bit early. It's just in a gradual way. For example, in a traditional experiment, you might say, okay, I'm going to run 300 people, and at that point I'm going to do a t-test and just stop collecting data, and in the next 10,000 people will get A. Here, a dynamic experiment is doing that bit by bit. It's starting off 50-50 and it's changing over time. Another challenge that came up is you get increased type 1 error. And what this means is that there isn't actually a difference between A and B, but when you do a hypothesis test on data from a dynamic experiment, you might falsely detect an effect. And so there's always some chance this happens in every experiment. And in other kinds of data, that's not even quantitative, maybe it's even higher. But the challenge here is that when you run a dynamic experiment, if you initially get data that randomly looks a bit worse, like B looks like it's lower rated explanations, then you might stop sampling from B and put more people in A. And so you actually end up at the end thinking B is worse than it really is. So it looks like there's a bigger difference, when in fact, B is not as bad as you think it is. So I wouldn't say this means that researchers shouldn't at all run dynamic experiments. I think that's still an open question. I think it's just we're trying to help people understand the pros and cons of these approaches. And one thing we're really excited about for the future is thinking, when can these dynamic experiments actually help speed up discovery? For example, if you want to test out 4 or 5 ideas, or you want to run 3 or 4 experiments at once, maybe these dynamic experiments could actually help you allocate data more efficiently, so that less promising ideas you stop collecting data on, and you test the most promising ones. So I want to just close on a final illustration of how we're trying to think about using experiments to discover how to personalize. Here's an example. Let's say that we're sending emails. We did send emails to people in an online course, trying to understand why they had been less active recently. So one brief, condition A was the brief message. Could you just take the survey about why you haven't been involved recently? Condition B, mention absence. It's been a while since you logged into the course, so we're eager to learn about experience. So we mentioned that. So the question now here is, which of these is going to be better for getting people to respond? a brief message or one that mentions that you're absent? Well, the response rate actually doesn't look like it's different between these. So what does that mean? Should you just give up and go home? Doesn't matter. Actually, when we broke up the data by low versus high activity people, we're seeing a trend that for low activity learners, the brief message seems to be better than the mention absence. Maybe because they're particularly low activity and they'll only read something that's very short. Whereas people who are high activity at first, but then dropped off, they were more likely to respond to the email that mentioned that they've been absent. Maybe because they want to justify why they've recently been disengaged. So this kind of pattern of results is what we're really looking for. And why it's nice is that we estimate that if we had actually personalized by sending low activity people a brief message, high activity mention absence, we could have increased response rates by 14.5%. So you can actually enhance an outcome, not by changing your design, but by figuring out which action do you take for which set of people. There's so much talk about personalization. We're all excited about it. For our lab, I think to us, we want to kind of hit this bar. If I have a belief that something is important to personalize, I want to prove to myself that if I randomize people to experience A versus B versus C, A is better than B for one group, B is better than A for another group. Or even the same student, A is better than B if they're really low motivation today, but B is better than A if they've got more motivation and are willing to jump in. So I think this is a nice empirical test of using experiments to discover how we can personalize. Does that make sense to people? And so I think this is a huge focus because we see a lot of promise in just testing out hypotheses about what's best for different users or the same person in different states, such as whether you've got your close to deadline or not. Might affect whether we help you to do more reflection and explaining, or whether we're more giving you hints that get you the answer quickly. But there are a lot of questions. How do we change the way we conceptualize experiments or design them differently to be personalizing, to actually test these ideas about what's working, when, and for who? How can we use qualitative work, such as interviews with people, to guide experimental design, like what variables we should personalize on? Are we focusing on growth mindset, levels of motivation, time to deadline? How do we figure out what to target? And I think one big question here is, how should dynamic experimentation algorithms balance personalization versus enhancement on average? And these are a set of algorithms that are called contextual bandits, which have been used a lot in different areas, but it's actually surprisingly rare to see real-world applications in education and even in health. To give you an intuition for what that means, one concern about experimentation, right, is always that it may be unfair, right, to give people different experiences. And so you might think as soon as something is looking good, or as soon as you think it's good, give it to everyone. But you all see how that approach of giving everyone one experience is actually really problematic for discovering what might be better for a subgroup of people. Let me give you one compelling example that we're trying to investigate now. In this setting, right, suppose that actually we think of something like a STEM course. And let's imagine we think about the fact that women are a minority of students. Suppose we found that there's some activity, like helping people set goals, or encouraging or motivating them, where one kind of motivation message is better for women than men, but the second message B is better for men than women. If women are 20% of the course, what would this graph look like? What you would find is that even though A is better than B for women, and because B is better than A for men, and men are a statistical majority, that would mean that actually, on average, it would look like B is better. And so you could think, well, let's actually give B to everyone. And so the key idea here is that when we think about designing multiple experiences, assuming that there's one kind of design to move forward to, and assuming that we know that design and we should have to test it, is really problematic. If we do dynamic experiments, what these algorithms could help with is that over time you'd be randomizing people 50-50, but then eventually you might see, well, for men, it looks like B is better than A. Let's give it to them 70% of the time, 80%, 90%. But for women,
the evidence will be less clear. It's not totally clear if A is better than B, so let's keep collecting data. So they might keep getting things 50-50. And so even if one group starts to get one condition more frequently over time, another group might get them with equal chance, or eventually, you could eventually discover that A is better than B for that group and give it more often. So to me, the really exciting idea here is that we kind of almost need to experiment to test our ideas about what's going to work for who. And the dynamic experiments mean that we don't just run it and then make a judgment call and we're done. We can keep experimenting forever, for years, and keep collecting data about what's working for different subgroups of people. What do you all think of that? Never stop experimenting. Because there may be hidden insights that we don't know about. And I think this is especially challenging if you think about like equity issues or people who are subgroups.
Or some notion of informed consent, informed participation.
Yes. So I mean, in all these studies, we ask for informed consent from people when we're doing it. So to give an overview here, I started this vision of perpetually improving systems. How do we take a piece of technology like an online programming homework, an app, and make it constantly improve, just like a real teacher does? And you saw our lab's approach. Let's use randomized A/B experiments, and let's think of how to make them more collective, dynamic, and personalizing. I gave one example of collective dynamic experimentation, where we had this system that would crowdsource from learners by asking them to explain their reasoning, and then would dynamically try and identify high-rated explanations, and these help learning just as much as explanations from an actual instructor. The second demonstration here was a tool we built for instructors, like any of you, to plug into their course and run their own experiments on their online homework, such as what feedback messages to give, or how to motivate people. And instructors found this was really helpful in helping them test on these ideas and reflect on pedagogy. And also appreciated that dynamic experiments could use data rapidly to help students. At the same time, we've done research to help researchers understand, here's some of the challenges you face when you analyze dynamic experiments. It may be a methodology you want to use, but here's some of the challenges or things you have to correct for, like a higher type 1 error rate. And I gave one example of what we're focusing on now, which is trying to discover how to personalize through experiments. It's a lot harder, but I showed that example where message A might be better than B for one group, but B is better than A for another group. And I think this is an especially important case for an argument for experimentation, and especially dynamic experimentation, because it allows you to keep collecting data and not just assume you know what's best, but gradually start giving each set of people what's best for them while collecting data to see if actually the opposite might be true for someone else, especially groups or people who might be a statistical minority. And there are a range of future directions that we're looking at now. Because I think that this is a broad area. There's so many open questions, right? There's so much that could be done with these methods in education, health, and other fields. And so one thing we're thinking about a lot is in dynamic experimentation, what kind of statistical analysis can we do? How do we actually modify these algorithms so that people can use them, whether it's instructors or researchers and scientists? How do we get interfaces for these buzzwords like interpretable machine learning, interactive machine learning? For us, this is interpretable interactive machine learning in the context of dynamic experiments. So you can actually change how the algorithm is helping you accomplish your goal of using data to improve a course. We're thinking a lot about how you rethink about experiments. How do we actually run many experiments at once so we can explore a whole design space? Not just explanations, but what prompts we give people to reflect, what motivational messages. How can we better use experiments to discover how to personalize? We want to raise that bar. In terms of specific applications, some things we're working on are how do we figure out what prompts we give students to explain? Like explain why your answer is correct, might be option A. B might be explain what concept you're using. And we might also vary whether they explain to themselves or to an instructor or another student. We're really interested in things like how do you give people hints, especially when they're programming. Of course, hints can be helpful on average, but how do we actually figure out what kind of hints are helpful, and when it's good to let people try it on their own. A big focus for us is also teaching meta skills. And we mean higher order skills that help students everywhere, in every course, in every part of their life. For example, setting goals and reducing procrastination. Who here can't benefit from learning those skills better? Within health, because as I mentioned, we think about the entire student, helping people learn not just formal education, but learn how to manage stress, how to exercise more, because that makes you more effective and happy as a person. How do we build apps that help people manage stress better? Or how do we take existing online activities and experiment with what questions we ask people to help them reflect on what's stressing them out? And when we ask questions versus give them suggestions. Another big area is actually encouraging exercise. So experimenting with which text messages we send people to get them to go to the gym more often or to walk more steps. As I mentioned, there are a few announcement opportunities. Email comments. Feel free to present in our online group meeting or just listen in on the mailing list. And if you think of students who are interested in grad school, and they can always volunteer remotely. And if you're interested in methodologies here, the human-computer interaction design, qualitative interviewing, the psychology, theories and experiments, the statistics angle for these complicated studies, or the machine learning, actually have all these materials online. You can contact me. And as I mentioned, if these are methodologies that could be useful in different grants, we apply for NSF and NIH grants from Canada, and so I'm open to these discussing those. Cool, all right, thank you. What kind of questions do people have?
So one thing I'm wondering is, as you're developing comparisons among different groups of people to see what is more effective in one group and less effective in another group, how do you decide what groups you're going to compare? Does that come out of your data? Do you approach that with some ideas already?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. That's a good deep question that I don't think we have great I don't think anyone really knows what the best answer is. I think that the way we tackle this is starting with different kinds of theories. For example, promotion versus prevention mindsets. Are you trying to do better in your course versus are you trying to avoid failure? If there's good evidence that that might be an important construct, then that's promising. But then one thing that I think human-computer interaction researchers are good at is that they try to actually interview users and understand them in the context of their course. For example, when we interview students, show them examples of what we're doing, we might find that that's not actually right. Those broad theories are fine, but they have to be contextualized. For example, in intro programming, it might be more about, are you kind of just afraid of starting because you're going to feel bad? Maybe that's a prevention mindset, maybe it's something else. So how do we measure that variable that could be relevant? And it's a really interesting iterative design loop because you think about variables that could be important in general, but then you have a very precise question, which is that variable relevant to the actions I'm going to take? For example, is it relevant to the emails I'm going to send them when an assignment's due? Or is it relevant to the motivational messages I show them when they're doing homework? So you kind of have this iterative back and forth between, of the things I can do, the actions I can take, what are the relevant variables I should be looking at to understand which actions are best based on someone's state? And I think that one way to tackle that is to go from prior work and theories, but also towards actually interviewing students, interviewing instructors to understand particular contexts. I think one thing that I'm trying to do more of is, I know I gave examples with subgroups, for example, low activity or high activity. But I think if we think about even within the same person at different points in time, you know, I'm really trying to think about that now where every week they do our homework online in Introduction to Programming. So you have 1,000 people, right? When are they doing it because they're super stressed and last minute? How much time do they have right now to work on this? And so trying to think about discovering those variables, right? Because then we can actually personalize by thinking, this week, what do you need the most? Are you really discouraged? Are you feeling high energy? Are you impatient and you don't want to be told you should write out your thoughts? Because that might help guide us what we do then.
And then you would look for patterns in their responses that are clues to which state they're in.
Yes. I mean, if you all have other ideas, like what are other ways we should be trying to figure out what are the actions we can take to help someone, and then what are the variables we should be thinking about personalizing on, you know? And things I found especially promising are things like online homework. I think it's really good because everyone has to do it. It's actually nicely scoped enough that you can get a dependent variable. How much time do they spend on it? What do they do afterwards? And so I think actions that you can get into there could be really promising. And I know that I presented simple actions like explanations, but should we be giving different motivational messages? Like some studies we ran in Khan Academy with growth mindset. Every time you make a mistake, it's a chance to learn more. Can we try and figure out which of those messages are going to help people based on their current state? Or do they need to be told right now that they're motivated, they just don't know what to do? And then you'd be told, well, what concepts are most relevant right now? How do you explain to a friend if they were stuck like you are? And it's such an interesting space of things we can test out. What are the questions that people have?
Yeah, again, to search for the meaning involved in, say, explanations, backing up. The reason that answer-based question was there was because it exemplifies not the whole course, but some aspects of it, presumably some concepts.
Okay.
So that was there. It may not be captured in the system. If it were captured, probably from whoever poses the question, it's called the instructor. What advantage could be taken of a characterization of in this case, the problem to suggest explanations, to bias them, perhaps as being more relevant to the concepts that underlie that problem. Looking for some way of getting at least more structure into the explanation. And something better than a word vec. I mean, this semantically near vacuous notion
Of that.
That's taken over.
Yeah, I think that's a nice thing, and I think that's where actually explanations, you could be down on explanations, right? But actually they're pretty complex. I'm explaining stuff to you right now. You just explain things to me, right? So maybe we should think of going deeper on that. What are all the features of explanations we could vary? For example, if you're teaching someone how to write a for loop to convert Fahrenheit to Celsius, how do we vary features like whether they have a visual or not? How do we vary whether we make it actually really relevant to Fahrenheit or to the Celsius case? How do we vary whether we include a sentence about why this is relevant to you in everyday life? There are all these really complex features we can vary. And we make all these implicit decisions about what to do whenever we speak to someone else. But hopefully, this kind of setting could allow us to really get deep and systematically figure out what's really helpful, what's necessary, and when.
And at least sort of following the pipe up from the question, you should be 1 degree away from the semantics relevant to the purpose of that course. Just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Do you have any thoughts or comments? Or
the examples you gave had instructors and they're in that like a systemized kind of school system.
yes.
How would you or could you adapt this for informal learning environments such as a science museum where you don't have that instructor to have that long-term relationship to build with the learner, and it's a very one-time fleeting
Kind of thing.
moment. But
Yeah,
how do you
so-
personalize that type of learning? Through
I think
this
that's a
design?
great question. So how do you adapt this to another environment? For example, informal science learning museum, right? And so I think it's great, and I'd love to be able to spell out in a paper the methodology we would use, but I think we're still figuring that out. Let me try it really quickly with you, like a micro study. Tell me about some behavior you want to get people to do. So they walk up to the museum exhibit. Do you want them to stay longer? Do you want them to actually say this was really cool? Do you want them to say they're inspired? Like, what's the dependent variable that you want to optimize?
Well, what we're really interested at the Hall is activating learning, so activating fascination, values, identity, belief, those types of self-perception, I guess, in a learner.
Got you. And so there's always going to be a bit of a trade-off between things you can measure and what you care about, and it's always a bit of a dance, right? But for example, after those exhibits, maybe you could find, is there some way to get people to express, like hit a button and say, oh wow, I want to share this with a friend because I could see how I was excited about this. If you can get that to not be a button and tap, but something like rating, that's nice because you get more data, right? Like, how strongly do you think your friend wants to see this? That's your dependent variable. Well, what's your experimental variable, your action variable? It might be actually that you all, whoever comes to the exhibit, or whoever's standing next to it, says things in a bunch of different ways. Force yourself to record 10 different ways of saying this. Like, show it to a bunch of people, to a child who's 4, who's 5, who's 6, and just brainstorm a bunch of them. Maybe even have people say it back to you. Like, hey, I explained that thing to you, but how would you get your friend excited about this? And that's where you get a bunch of action variables, experimental variables, right? That you can pick out features from. And so I think that actually might be a setting, right? Where you could then start to think about how to test out those different ways of explaining a concept and then seeing how they impact the kind of outcomes you care about. And then there's one more step, right? What we call like contextual variables. Do we want to personalize this based on how much time someone wants to spend in your exhibit? If it's 0 minutes, 1 minute, 2 minutes? Is it based on their actually particular interest in science? Like whether they care about chemistry or physics, or actually they care about humanities? You know, that's something where I think you would try and brainstorm those ideas. And maybe one interesting insight here is that it might be that actually you don't have to do this necessarily just at your exhibit in the real world, right? I sometimes see real world settings as a source of problems, right? You can say, here's the thing we care about, like what you just told me. I want to optimize this. You could tell me better than what I just said to you, what variables you want to vary, and what context you care about. Then maybe put on a psychologist hat and say, can I run a lab experiment or an experiment somewhere else that can shed light on this? Could you go and recruit a bunch of people on Reddit and basically pose those things and try and get some sense of what which kind of explanations work in different contexts? Record some videos and post them on Reddit and see how people will like them. It may not be exactly like your context, I'm just throwing out an idea, but I think that sometimes I worry that I think, oh, it's not like my context, I can't learn anything. Whereas maybe the better question is, it's not like my context, Reddit, or lab studies, but how close is it? Is it like 0 correlation? Is it a correlation of 1? Or if it's in between, if there's a 0.3 or 0.5, at least I could use this other context where I can get lots of data and control things to then inform what I do in my real world exhibit. I'm not sure if that seems plausible to you all, if that just seems like that methodology is just too far afield.
I think in practice it may be a little bit more difficult.
Yes.
Especially if we're interested in kids.
Mm-hmm.
Just researching on kids, like young kids, is difficult.
It's true, and I think that's why, so I mean, like I mentioned crowdsourcing, this is a whole field in human-computer interaction, right? One thing you might think is, if you were to frame a problem, could you almost like put it in a competition? I'd love researchers around the world in psychology and education who are good at doing these large-scale studies to make some proposals for studies they think should be run in a lab, in MTurk, or in my museum. And then see, you know, could that be a way of getting ideas from people? Because again, it's hard to do with children, but is there something similar between children and adults? Or children and some other population you can tap into? Something similar between 4-year-olds and 10-year-olds that you could then learn about it. I mean, there are tons of differences, right? But what I would focus on is what might be similar so that you can learn something from that other population. Because then you get an alternative source of data to complement your in-person interaction, right? You get lots of good data about speak to them and seeing what they say, but it might be helpful to kind of get data from other sources. And a lot of things I think about are, how do we align researchers with relevant interests with practical problems? Like you have a practical problem, right? I bet there's 5 researchers out there who are dying to work on that problem. How do you find them, right? And is there also some app out in the App Store that's trying to give children science games? There could be a little mini test bed for getting that kind of data. So that requires work, but that to me is kind of exciting because then you could actually give them your real world problem, make sure that apps are actually targeting like the kind of high quality learning you do in law and school of science. But then they can also give you something in return, which is data about what might be good to try out. Do you have anything you want to ask about or comments you want to make?
Just great presentation. No questions.
Excellent. All right, great. Well, thanks so much for having me. It was great. I appreciate all the comments and input. This was really interesting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure. All the people on YouTube can drop us an email with ideas.
Yeah.